Chapter 1 of your textbook deals with writing in a very general way. The idea of the chapter is that there are certain core concepts that apply to almost all writing, especially all good writing. In this brief lecture, I'm going to talk about the first two concepts. First of all, that good writing varies from open to closed form, and that good writers pose questions about their subject matter. Concept 1 actually approaches writing in a way you've probably not thought about before. The terms that are used in this section, closed form and open form, aren't terms that we are sort of naturally familiar with, so they take a little bit of explanation. So what is closed form prose or open form prose? Well, first of all, let's get the word prose out of the way. It just means writing. Writing that's not poetry is prose. So we're talking about writing in closed forms and open forms, but those terms are still a little unclear. The book provides some examples of what open form writing and closed form writing looks like. It says in Figure 1.1 on page 10 and 11, it talks about closed forms having explicitly stated theses. It talks about them having a forecasted structure or body paragraphs with topic sentences, whereas open-formed prose says often is organized chronologically or has story-like elements, often has an implicit theme rather than a thesis. And those elements are accurate. I think they're right about some of the characteristics of open form and closed form prose, but they don't do a very good job of explaining really what the difference is. The key idea here is that in different writing situations, you as the writer have different levels of control over the writing. In other words, different responsibility for making decisions about the writing. And you know this. Sometimes you've been in classes where a teacher has given you an assignment where the teacher has identified what you're supposed to write about, identified the length, identified the style maybe. Maybe told you to write an academic style or a more formal style. Sometimes they may even identify how many paragraphs you're going to write or give you an overall structure like the 5-paragraph model for writing papers. In those situations, in other words, you as the writer don't get to make a lot of those decisions. The decisions have been made for you, and essentially by the expectations of your audience, in most cases the teacher. In other writing situations, though, you do get to make a lot of decisions about what the writing will look like. Sometimes you may have even writing assignments where the teacher allows you much more flexibility in terms of the content of the writing or the structure of the writing or even the style of the writing. Probably an extreme example would be writing in a journal or diary that you have where you are the intended audience, and as a result, you can write pretty much however you want. You can write about whatever you want. You can write in paragraphs or not in paragraphs or however many paragraphs you want. You can structure the writing however you want. And that's really the key difference between closed form and open form writing. Closed form just means more decisions have been made for you by the audience. Whereas in open form prose, you have a lot more flexibility. You get to make more decisions about the writing. So closed form writing might be, most academic essays, especially things like 5-paragraph papers or research papers that you may have written in the past where the form is very set. And open form writing would be more narrative writing, storytelling. Poetry, obviously, is often more open form. Not all poetry. Some poetry is very structured and has very clear expectations, but other poetry you have a lot more flexibility to write in the way you want. Now, that's not to say that narrative or poetry or even a journal is absolutely open form prose. In fact, an important point in this concept is the idea that all writing exists somewhere on the continuum between open form and closed form. There's no such thing as absolutely closed form writing. I suppose filling in a form that like at a doctor's office is about as closed form as you can get, and writing experimental poetry with no meter, rhythm, rhyme, etc. That's about as open form as you can get. But most writing exists somewhere in the middle, where you as the writer get to make some decisions about the writing, but not all of those decisions. So that's the idea in open form and closed form writing. And throughout the semester, we're going to be doing, a lot of different kinds of writing. The first assignment, your first essay in this class is a personal narrative, and narrative tends to be more open in form. Later in the semester, we'll move towards academic writing, which tends to be more closed in form. It's actually an interesting point. Many students believe they prefer open form prose to closed form prose as a writer. Many students believe that what they hate is rules and expectations, and if they're given the freedom to write how they want, they're going to enjoy it more. But I find that many writers find out when they try to write open form prose that it's actually very challenging. It's a lot of responsibility as a writer to write open form prose, to give you as the writer the responsibility for deciding what will make it successful. Later in the semester, when we do the closed form prose, you'll have a clearer roadmap for how to write a successful paper than you will for open form prose. But that's the basic idea in open form and closed form prose. Concept 2 states that good writers pose questions about their subject matter. And to some degree, that may be sort of common sense, and to another degree, it may be kind of counterintuitive. You may, in fact, have been taught by previous teachers that you should not include questions in your writing. But I don't think that's really what Concept 2 is talking about. I don't think that Concept 2 is about the appearance of questions in your writing, but rather sort of the mindset of a writer, that good writers think about writing as attempts to answer questions. In other words, a good writer thinks about writing as a way of solving a problem or providing information that an audience will want or need or will answer something for them. Concept 2 goes on to give certain qualifications for successful questions. It says that a good question in writing is one that is problematic for the audience, a good question is one that's significant, and a good question is one that's interesting to the writer. And those terms probably take a little bit of explanation. The idea of the question being problematic for the audience is that the question may not have one set answer. In other words, if the question is, what is 2 plus 2, or what color is the sky on a sunny day, those questions aren't problematic because we can all, writer and audience, agree on the answers. 2 plus 2 is 4, the sky is blue. And so there's not much to work with there. There's not much meat to that kind of question. A better question is one that has different ways of answering. In other words, that there may be different opinions on the subject, or the question may appear simple, but really it's complicated, or appear to have one answer, but in truth it's got a different answer. There's got to be something to think about in a successful question. That's really what it means to say that the question is problematic. The second point, that a question is to be significant, really just means that the question needs to matter to the audience. In other words, that the audience needs to see the question as having some relevance to their lives, or being important enough, I guess, to answer. There may be a lot of different ways of answering the question of what am I going to have for dinner tonight? But the audience isn't going to see that as a significant question. The audience doesn't care what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, even if I don't know the answer, even if I've been thinking a lot about it during the day. That's not something that the audience is going to consider important enough for them to care about. The third point is that the good question needs to be interesting to the writer. In other words, you need to be interested enough in the material yourself that you can engage with the question somehow. If you're going through the motions of writing just because you have an assignment and you are not interested in the subject matter, you're not interested in solving the problem or answering the question yourself, that's going to come through to the reader. The reader is going to be able to figure out that this is not something that you're interested in, and as a result, they're not going to be interested in it. The best writing, and I'm sure that this is something that you've already experienced, the writing that's the most enjoyable to write, is writing about a subject that you have some interest in, about questions that you want to answer, not just questions that you think the audience, especially if you think the audience is the teacher, would want to answer. So to review, a good question is one that is problematic. In other words, there's different ways of thinking about it. It's significant. It has to matter. There has to be something at stake for the reader. And it needs to be one that's interesting, at least to you, and hopefully to the reader as well.